So tonight we're going to have a discussion on why do bad things happen in the world today. So I've broken it up into three segments. And the first segment sort of talks about what happened in the beginning. In the beginning, God, etc. Then we're going to have the middle sections going to talk about things that people might consider as, quote, bad, things that happen in the world. I have some few pictures here of snakes and rats and bacterias. So most people consider those to be bad things, but we'll examine to see if those really are bad things. And then the last part, I've taken a swipe at trying to put out, and I'd like to have discussion at the end on this, try to put out why do we think as Christians that there are bad things in the world. There's, it's one of the challenges that atheists and agnostics always throw at us, probably when you're witnessing or talking to Christians, other Christians, or you're talking to agnostics or atheists, that they always challenge you, well, if you have a good God, why does he let bad things, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., happen? So we'll do that. So those are the three things, and I'll jump into it and get started. As always, I start with the mission statement of this organization. We're the Biblical Creation Science Group. And we have four functions. First of all, to exalt Jesus Christ. That's our first function, always number one. Number two is to teach the Bible. So we'll throw in pertinent Bible quotations that pertain to what we're talking about in the different lectures that we give, and tonight's no different. We want to equip the saints. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about trying to witness to the world. We're commanded by Jesus Christ to be witnesses to the world. And then finally, to tell the world. So those are our four goals in this talk, as all of the other ones that we present. So I always like to start in Genesis. These are some pictures I pulled off the web. But in the beginning, God created everything perfect. He tells us that. He tells us that God created mankind in his own image in Genesis 1:27. And then in Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. So to God, something that is very good to God is perfect. He doesn't allow anything that's imperfect. That's, as Rob has taught us many times, that's sin. The archer shoots his arrow, and where it lands, and the distance from where the arrow lands and to the very exact center of the target is called the sin distance. That's how far off you are from perfection. And so God is telling us at the end of the sixth day, everything was perfect. And so we can only imagine. We don't have details of what the Garden of Eden was like. We know it was filled with trees and fruit-bearing trees and plants and all the herbs and everything that we needed, and the animals needed to eat. So in the beginning, the men and the animals were all vegetarians. Hello, welcome. But then everything changed, as we know. Again, in Genesis 2, the Lord told Adam, "You're free to eat from any tree in the garden." 17, "But you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat it, you will certainly die." So that was the commandment. We had, as human race, we had one commandment from God, not 10 commandments that Moses brought down, or hundreds of commandments like the Jewish people had from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We had one commandment, and we didn't keep it. So that's the original sin. And I've taken a little piece out of Genesis 3:2. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that's in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. You will certainly die. You will certainly not die, the serpent said to the woman, who was Satan talking to the woman. So that was the lie. And as a consequence of that, being seduced by the devil, God placed a curse. He placed a curse on the serpent. So he made the serpent crawl on his belly for all time. To the woman, he gave women pain in childbirth. To the man, he gave extremely hard work to be able to survive and feed his family. And then the final curse was to all life return to dust. All will die. So that was the consequence of our not obeying God. And so the very first thing we see is we're the ones that are responsible for bringing these things into our lives. God created everything perfect. And then finally, in Genesis 3:23-24, so the Lord banished Adam and Eve from the garden to work the ground and able to survive, and clothe them with animal skin. So the first death in the garden was an animal of some kind that gave, or more, one or more animals that gave their skin to clothe the people. And God put a cherubim, a fearful creature with a flaming sword that prevented them from going back into the garden. So if they were tempted, they yearned to go back to what they had before. They couldn't do it. They were prevented. So just in summary, I put a beautiful picture with two people in the garden with the animals. I put a T-Rex over there, over by the waterfall, just because the dinosaurs were there with Adam and Eve. And then the summary is Adam and Eve and the fall disobeyed God's one and only commandment, and through pride, they wanted to be like God. It's because the serpent told the people, you will be like God. You'll have the knowledge of good and evil. And through pride, wanting to be like God, and then ultimately doubting God's word. And they took Satan's word over God's word. So that's another activity that happened. And then they hid from God, as we're told in Genesis, and they took no responsibility. I love it to read that part, because human nature hasn't changed. When God said, why did you do it? Eve said, the snake made me do it. He charmed me, made me do it. And of course Adam, he threw Eve under the bus, as they say in the parlance nowadays. He said, the woman made me do it. So we're back to the Garden of Eden. We're pointing fingers and not taking responsibility, and so that's the situation. And the sad part is, when you continue to read on, the first son of Adam and Eve, Cain, killed his brother Abel. So the first son of the offspring of Adam and Eve was a murderer of his own brother. So just sort of set the stage for what we know. It's a pretty sad picture to start off the history of the universe. So a couple of things that come to mind is in John and Romans, we're told, do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. So he's telling us that the Father is not the cause of the problem. And then in Romans, is one of our quotations we use in this study often is, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, and his good, pleasing and perfect will. So that's what we want to do today. We want to go through and take a very detailed look at some of the things that we might think are, quote, bad, and then we'd like to go to the spiritual world at the end and see what the situation is, and maybe at the end, very end, have a discussion to see how we can mutually witness to non-believers to see if we can answer that question. So from the science point of view, we know that life is a very complex system. That's one thing a couple of talks ago that we talked about, that there's all of these systems that exist in the world. And for the living creatures, we all know that we have the seed of life within ourselves. So it could be humans, it could be rabbits, it could be trees, it could be tomatoes. Everything has the ability to reproduce after its own kind. And so we were born to be immortal, but because of the sin, we brought death into the world. So reproduction is required in order to continue the kinds as we go forward in time. So we really need to see God's perfect plan. Everything is a system and has a perfect cycle of life. So we're going to go through a few of those cycles and see. But the one that usually comes to mind, it's the easiest to explain, and it's illustrated so beautifully in Scripture, is through Ecclesiastes 1:7, is all rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. So this is the water cycle, and we've learned that in school, that rivers run down into lakes, and the lakes empty into oceans, and then the oceans and the lakes have evaporation, go back up, the water's stored in the clouds, and then as the wind blows, the clouds go over mountains and cool off, and they drop their water either as snow or rain, and the water runs back down into the rivers to start it all over again. So that's a really clear cycle that we see with regard to water. And it also pertains to God's creatures. There's many quotes. I just chose 4 here that talk about how God provides for his creatures. In Matthew, it says, "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" In Genesis, "And all of the beasts of the earth, and all of the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. Job, "Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food?" Or Psalms, "He provides food for the cattle and for the young ravens when they call." So it shows that God, in his infinite wisdom, has provided food for every creature that exists on our planet. And to be able to feed every animal through the germination of plants and let them eat and provide for them, that's something that's number one activity that he blesses the animals as he blesses us. So he provides all of that nourishment for the animals. And so we come up with the cycle that's most important is the nutrition cycle. And this basically is what they call, think of God's ultimate recycling. And this example of how God provides free for clean water for us to breathe and the animals clean water for us to drink, clean air to breathe, food for us to eat, and other essentials without having to manufacture anything. So we didn't have to build a plant to generate oxygen. It was here. We didn't have to build a plant to generate nitrogen. It was here. Carbon dioxide, it was here. All of the elements that are required to sustain life were here from the beginning when God made everything. So the cycles of the bodies of plants, animals, and microbes are critical to maintaining the health of all of the Earth's ecosystems. So that really is kind of the main thrust of the next section I'll be talking about, is how all of these cycles dovetail and mesh, and how one being interacts with another in order to provide what we need in order to sustain the whole ecosystem that we have and we live in. So here's 3 pictures. We've got plants in the upper left-hand corner, animals over to the right, and down at the bottom are the bacteria. And it's basically has to be started. We need an energy source, and the energy source for the Earth is the sun, our sun. There's both the SUN that we need for light energy and the SON that we need for spiritual energy. But in this case, the plants need the SUN in order to give them energy, as we talked about when we talked a couple of weeks ago about the plants and photosynthesis and everything. They need that to, along with carbon dioxide and water and other nutrients, in order to make the sugars that they provide so that the animals can eat. So if you look at the 3 types, you have producers, the plants, you have the consumers, which are the animals, and then at the bottom you have the very necessary decomposers, which are the bacteria. So you need all 3 of those in order for the system to work, to be a closed system. So the sun and the water and the carbon dioxide and the nutrients go into the plants. They provide food and oxygen to the animals. The animals, in return, give them carbon dioxide. You know, we hear about carbon dioxide and global warming and everything. Actually, carbon dioxide is, if we didn't have any of it, if it were 0, we would die, because there wouldn't be any food for the plants. So they absolutely, as we breathe oxygen, they require CO2. Oops, something happened. So let's get there. And then the next part is, then the animals have waste, which is a nitrogen-bearing compound, but that waste, or even if the animal dies, it's either excretion from the animal, or if the animal happens to die and decomposes, then that all turns out to be food for the bacteria. So they require that to have food in order to survive. And then they, in turn, provide, they actually change the nitrogen the way it comes to them, and they change it into a form that can be used by the plants. So what a miracle. You know, you get sun that feeds the plants feed the animals feed the plants, and then through the decomposition of the waste matter, the bacteria change that back into a substance, the nitrogen. You know, when you put fertilizer on your garden or your lawn, it's filled with nitrogen. So that's what the plants need in order to grow. So that, I mean, that's such a blessing. And so I have a little video here. Let's see if it's either too loud or too soft, and we're going to talk about that cycle of life, or the food chain.
Here in the Everglades, as in all ecosystems, every living thing is linked together to form a very complex community. Everything is connected in some way. In order to grow and survive, there are 2 things that every organism needs: matter and energy. But where do these things come from, and how do they pass from one living thing to another? This process, the flow of energy and matter through a community, is most easily understood by constructing a simple illustration we call a food chain. Today we'll construct a typical Everglades food chain. But the story really starts about 93 million miles from South Florida. The sun is like an enormous nuclear reactor, radiating its rays across the solar system. Without the sun's energy, there would be no life on Earth. Without the sun, there would be no plants, the first link in our chain of life. Green plants, as well as cyanobacteria and certain types of algae, are able to harness the energy of the sun converting it to food energy in the form of sugary compounds. We call these organisms producers, and this is where our food chain begins. The Everglades are full of producers, from sawgrass to mangroves. One very important producer is a slimy goo called periphyton. Periphyton is complicated stuff, but it's basically a mixture of different types of algae. It can be found covering the limestone floor and many of the submerged plants of the Everglades. The second link of our food chain is occupied by what we call a primary consumer. This is an herbivore, or a plant eater. For our chain, we'll use the mosquito larva. In its larval form, the mosquito is an aquatic herbivore, swimming around munching on organic matter. It loves periphyton. The gambusia, on the other hand, loves mosquito larvae. This is why we also call him the mosquito fish. We'll stick him in the third link of our food chain. The gambusia is what we call a secondary consumer. Secondary consumers are animals that eat primary consumers. Because the gambusia mostly eats other animals, he can be classified as a carnivore. The great blue heron is a fish eater. He has a dagger-like bill designed for spearing and snatching swimming prey. The heron is able to nab some pretty big fish, but the gambusia makes a nice appetizer. Because he mostly eats secondary consumers, this makes the great blue heron a tertiary consumer and gives him a spot on our fourth link. Now for the big guy. The American alligator is a formidable beast. As a fully grown adult, he's way at the top of the food chain. He's what we call a top predator, also known as an apex predator. For the gator, an unobservant great blue heron would be gourmet dining. This guy is aware of the danger. Time to go sunbathe elsewhere. When we construct a food chain, we notice that there are usually no more than about 4 or 5 links from producer to top predator. There's a good reason for this. When one organism eats another organism, it uses up a lot of the food energy that is taken in, instead of passing all of it up to the next link in the chain. Much of that energy is used in digestion and other metabolic processes as the organism grows, and passes out into the environment as heat energy. At the same time, a lot of the matter is excreted as waste and is incorporated into the soil. In fact, the rule of thumb is that only about 10% of the energy that is consumed by an organism passes on to the next level. This is called the 10% rule. So basically, there can't be too many links in the chain, or the predators at the top of the food chain won't be able to get enough food energy to grow and survive.
So that was interesting. I didn't know that 10% rule. That was kind of interesting. So you see, he took a particular ecosystem and went through the stages of that particular one. But I think you can see how it applies to almost any other ecosystem, like the desert or the plains or mountains. So let me start with kind of the higher up and work my way down to smaller things. So I'll start with the bigger things. And one of the creatures that was in the Bible and that we were tempted by. They used the snake as an example of a cunning animal that was to be feared, because there's a possibility of being hit with venom. So the snake is a predator for smaller mammals, and in some cases, as it said, smaller snakes sometimes eat insects and earthworms and small prey, but they're a very valuable resource for farmers and other activities that require control over smaller mammals like rodents and things like that would decimate a crop or eat a lot of the forest or farmland. So snakes are important. You don't want to necessarily have a rattlesnake in your kitchen, but if they stay outside in a safe distance from your kids and your animals, and they're a good thing to have. And God put them on earth for a reason. They're occur in high densities. One of the things that I learned by putting this together is that because they're cold-blooded, they're extremely efficient in transferring that biomass. You're talking about when these chain of predators, one after the other, starting with the mosquito, and then going up to the gambusi fish, and then the bird, and then finally the apex predator. The snake actually is much more efficient in creating biomass than some of the warm-blooded animals because it's cold-blooded. So it says snakes are 25 times more efficient at turning food into biomass than carnivores or in the mammals. And so they're very important with regard to maintaining the ecosystems. So we'll give snakes a pass. They may not be your favorite pet, but they're a good thing. Now rodents. And some people keep rodents as pets, but one thing you find out when you're looking at how things fit together, if you can't be anything, if you're a living creature, at least you can be food for somebody else. And that was one of the things that popped out when they were talking about rodents. Again, rodents are oftentimes thought of as vermin. Farmers hate them because they eat their crops, but they're a food source for birds and reptiles and amphibians and other mammals, and even some fish. If they go along the shore of a river, then the rodents are a source of food. And even people, some of these large rodents in Southeast Asia are actually hunted as food for human beings. So that's one thing that they do that's a positive. Second thing that they do that's positive is they're a seed spreader. And if you think of it, rodents collect seeds, and a lot of times they put them aside for later in the year if they're gathering things, nuts and seeds during the summer months, and they're putting it away for the winter time. Then they're storing those seeds. So they're storing the seeds, and as it says, not every seed is eaten. So the ones that they don't consume, that they leave underground, they bury them in their little trenches and the holes that they dig into the ground. Those sprout, and that is a source of propagating plants. So they help the ecosystem by reproducing plants. That they take the seeds from one place and move them to another, and by that motion, they're like little farmers. And if they don't eat this stuff, then it gets to grow again, make another plant. And then there are soil aerators. We know that many of the small rodents are burrowing animals. They dig in the ground, and if you think of it, those tunnels are their habitat, but they're also aerating the ground. It allows, if there's a rainstorm, for the water to run into those holes, and it's a very efficient way of watering the plants and the trees and the forests and in the prairies that they live in. So by just digging in the ground, they're doing a service to the plants and vegetation that grow in the area. And it's a more efficient kind of watering because the water can get to the roots of the trees and things like that. So it's another positive. And then finally, again, as we learned in our talk on the plants, we found that the fungus was one of the major ways that the trees had of spreading the carbon that they had from the mother trees to the baby trees that are nearby. And fungus is what's used as a mechanism that takes the carbon from the roots of the trees and propagates it throughout the floor of the forest. And squirrels and other animals interact with the fungus, and they spread spores, or even if they have their droppings, because they eat fungus, and then the seed of the fungus is in the spore, and those droppings are all over the forest. So again, it's another way, they're not people who are paid to go out to the national forest and spread the fungus spores around. It's all done by the little creatures that are roaming around there. So that's really a wonder, all of the things that the rodents do to propagate the life in the plants and other parts of the forest. The ants, those are very unwelcome in your kitchen, and they always somehow turn up around Christmas or Thanksgiving. I don't know how they know, but the ants always know when Christmas and Thanksgiving, when you've got a room full of, or a whole house full of people that are getting ready to sit down to dinner, and you go in the kitchen and there's a whole patch of them attacking. We had that exact thing happen to us. So you gotta have some reservation about ants, but they're also extremely important. They have a very unique kind of society that they live in. Most of the workers are the females, the non-fertile females, and the males are, there's a few fertile males that service the queen who is fertile, and they propagate the ant species, but it's important that they carry nutrition around. They spread, you see them in videos carrying leaves and everything around the forest. So they're not only feeding themselves, but they're taking organic matter here and there. They're also essential to the well-being of other life. They act as decomposers by feeding organic waste, and they kill other insects. So ants are one of the most deadly forms of insect control in the forest. They kill other ants. The ants are warring with other ants to keep their populations down. So that's one thing. They decompose dead animals. So you don't see, you might see a dead animal in the middle of the road as roadkill, but you don't usually, when you're hiking or walking around one of the trails here, you don't see a lot of dead animals, because when they pass away, the ants and the bacteria decompose them and pretty much eat everything that's available. And they're a source of food to other animals, like it says down at the bottom, woodpeckers and other predators, even bears. Sometimes tear open ants' nests and start eating the ants as a food source. So again, if you can't be anything else, you can be food for somebody else. Roaches. So it really takes a little bit of doing to fall in love with a roach, but it says, the material that I read is that there's only 1% of the roach species that are the ones that affect our houses. So the other 99% of the roach species are out doing their things in nature, and they don't necessarily come into the house. There's 5,000 known species of cockroach. They have a function of breaking down material that they eat and spreading seeds around. So many times the roaches will provide a very good function there of spreading seeds. And also they're a food for, again, woodpeckers and small birds and other animals because they get bigger. It says if roaches in the wild disappeared, the birds and lizards that feed on them would suffer, and they might even become extinct. But the roaches, they ask the question, well, what about the roaches that infect the households? And they said even the people who study bugs, they said you could kill them and it wouldn't really make any difference to ecology. So I think that's one thing. When you got roaches in the house, you want to take care of them, and you're not really doing harm to anything. And then spiders. I better go past that picture or my daughters will freak out. They look small and insignificant and creepy. They look creepy. But they're one of the predators for other insects. They're one of the most effective predators for other insects. And they hold a very unique niche in the ecological system for insect control. And they have one property that's kind of amazing is they live throughout the winter. They don't die off or go into the egg, go into an egg and just stay there over the winter. They actually live over the winter. And so when gardens are first coming up in the first phases of the new season, when gardens are coming and there's other predators that are out there that are going to eat the fruits and vegetables, especially when they're young plants, very tender and vulnerable to insect attack, then the spiders come out first thing and they take care of those early predators for the plants and eat them up. So they're a very useful insect in the scheme of things. And they found out by studying them that they actually cooperate, the spiders cooperate, and they're much more effective in reducing the insect population when there's a cooperation between the spiders. And also they have some of the venom of the spiders. They are used to treat diseases. And they spin silk just like silkworms, so they have some other good benefits. They also bite people, and if you've had a spider bite or something, it gets red and ugly for a while, and hopefully you don't get real sick from it. But people generally stay away from them if they can. Bees. I think anybody who's seen the movie, the Bee, the Bee movie, I think will resonate with bees. Yeah, they have a stinger and you can get stung by a bee, but they're extremely important with regard to every food that we eat because they're the main pollinator. God's pollinators are the bees. So they estimated that the bee pollination was worth over $14 billion in the United States. So they pollinate 80% of the flowering crops, and much 1/3 of the food that we eat is pollinated by bees. So they're extremely critical. You don't want them flying around in your car when you're driving on the freeway, but out in the wild they're very useful. They do cross-pollination of plants. They have certain bees that actually are attracted to certain kind of flowers, so they're not just a general service pollinator. They pollinate specific flowers, and they can visit, it says at the bottom, between 50 and 1,000 flowers on one trip, and taking 30 minutes to 4 hours. So they need the pollen in order to take back to the hive to produce what they call bee milk, or royal jelly to feed the queen, and that's how they have baby bees. And so that's critical. But in making the honey, that's critical. The honey is used for many, many different things other than sweetening your tea in the morning. It has medical purposes. So. And honey, I've been told, I don't know if anybody knows differently, but I've been told that it never goes bad. So you can keep honey in your cabinet. So if there's a famine, keep that honey. Okay, so bacteria, you can't see them. I don't think you can love them necessarily. The thing that they do is they live in a symbiotic relationship with plants and animals. And if you want to get some sort of idea of how many bacteria there are, they said there's approximately 5 times 10 to the 30th bacteria on Earth. And if you weighed the bacteria, all of the bacteria on Earth, they would weigh more than all of the plants and animals on Earth. So that's how many bacteria there are. There are many more bacteria than the known number of stars in the universe. So they're everywhere. And so let's see, they're really vital in recycling nutrients. As that slide showed, they were the decomposers. We called them the decomposers down at the bottom. And so they're really important for decomposing dead things and turning it into material, whether it be nitrogen that's going back into plants or carbon going back into the atmosphere. So they're critical to have, and they have amazing ability. They can live in icy cold water. They actually live in acid hot springs, and they've been found by the vents down at the bottom of the ocean. They have these vents where the material from the center of the earth comes up, and you see it as a black bubbling sort of cauldron, and they've taken samples of material right at the base of that, they call them chimneys, where that material comes out. The water is extremely hot, and they look at it and it's filled with bacteria. So bacteria have the ability to survive in very, very strange and hostile, what we would find hostile environments. And I guess, the thing I found was you can think of the bacteria as being sort of the janitors of planet Earth. So whenever there's any refuse or things that you don't want, then the bacteria consumes it and converts it into something that's useful, and then goes on and repeats that over and over and over. So I thought that was kind of a interesting thing. So let's play this next video.
You know about recycling, right? We all probably sort our trash to save things like aluminum cans, plastic bottles, and newspaper. We all probably also know why we do it, to conserve resources. What would happen if we didn't conserve resources? Well, the things that are used to make up those products might become more scarce, leading companies to search for more raw natural resources from the environment, which drives up prices. In some cases, new ways would have to be engineered to make those products if new sources can't be found. Recycling is just a good idea, and nature is a master recycler. Even when humans don't, nature will get its way and cycle atoms and molecules back again. Carbon and nitrogen are great examples of how nature does this. One of the ways that nature recycles matter is through the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is carbon cycling through the global environment. Carbon is a chemical element and a key component of many systems in the biosphere, from acting as part of the Earth's thermostat to being one of the key elements in photosynthesis, which is when plants make sugars for energy. In order for the ecosystem to function properly, all parts need an adequate supply of carbon. This is usually not a problem, since nature is efficient at carbon cycling. Since the process is a cycle, we need to pick some place to begin. One of the biggest reservoirs of carbon is the atmosphere, which is about 0.038% carbon dioxide. There are two ways for carbon to be removed from the atmosphere. The first is through photosynthesis, where plants take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to create sugars for energy, and oxygen gas emerges as a byproduct. Once inside plants, carbon moves through food chains, where organisms become nutrients, including herbivores, carnivores, and ultimately decomposers. Through living organisms, carbon is either re-released back into the atmosphere through respiration, where organisms use oxygen to generate energy from nutrients and produce carbon dioxide as waste, released by combustion, the process of burning something, or broken down into the soil as part of the organism's body. Once buried in the soil, carbon can be converted into fossil fuels over long periods of time, and then also re-enter the atmosphere by combustion. If carbon from the atmosphere does not enter a terrestrial or land plant by photosynthesis, it can dissolve in the ocean. Here it can be taken up by marine plants through photosynthesis, just like in land plants, or it can be incorporated into sediments. Marine organisms can also take up dissolved carbon molecules and use that along with calcium in the seawater to make calcium carbonate, which is a major component of the shells and skeletons of marine organisms. When these organisms die, their shells and bones settle to the bottom of the ocean, where they can be covered up and remain for long periods of time. Under great pressure from the water and sediment, these shells break down and form limestone rock. Limestone is the largest storage reservoir of carbon on the Earth. Once formed into limestone, carbon usually stays locked in the rock. However, it can also dissolve very slowly to be released as carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, or if the limestone is exposed to weathering and dissolved by acid rain, be released as carbon dioxide. This completes the cycle, returning all carbon back to the atmosphere where it began. So following this line of thinking, the carbon molecules that are in our body have been cycling on the Earth since it was formed and will continue to do so as we exhale each breath, returning CO2 back to the atmosphere. Like carbon, nitrogen also has always been present on the Earth, and in the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen cycles through the global environment. Nitrogen is also a chemical element, and it is the most abundant element in the atmosphere, making up 78% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is very unreactive with other elements, and it cannot be used directly as a nutrient by plants and animals the way oxygen or carbon can. However, nitrogen can be converted into forms usable by plants and animals either by lightning or bacteria. Once converted to usable forms, nitrogen is able to cycle the rest of the way through the ecosystem. As mentioned, the atmosphere is the largest reservoir of nitrogen. N2 occurs when two atoms of nitrogen are bonded together very strongly. Lightning has enough energy to split these atoms, which then bond with oxygen in the atmosphere to make nitrates that fertilize the soil and are taken into plants as nutrients. In a process known as nitrogen fixation, special bacteria can convert nitrogen gas in the atmosphere directly into ammonia, which is an important nutrient for plants. In this manner, nitrogen enters the ecosystem from the atmosphere. This conversion is performed either by cyanobacteria in the soil or by a bacteria that lives in the roots of certain plants known as legumes, such as soybeans or alfalfa. In this image, the bacteria are the dark spots that live inside the roots of the soybean plant. Legumes have nodules on the roots that house these nitrogen-fixing bacteria known as rhizobium. Once nitrogen is split into nitrates, or fixed by bacteria, plant roots can absorb nitrogen compounds in a process known as assimilation. Once absorbed, DNA, proteins, and amino acids are the main nitrogen-containing compounds in the plant. Animals also need nitrogen to make these same compounds, so they get it from the food they eat, like plants or other animals. Nitrogen is then held in the body in these organisms until they die. After death, decomposers like fungus and bacteria convert the nitrogen from the proteins, DNA, and other compounds back into ammonia substances and eventually to nitrogen gas to be used again. Matter on the Earth operates in a closed system where the atoms and molecules continually cycle around through the Earth's systems. This is the case for both the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Both of these cycles model the pathways that each specific kind of atom or molecule takes as it flows around to different living and non-living components of the environment through processes like photosynthesis in the carbon cycle and nitrogen fixation in the nitrogen cycle. The largest reservoirs of carbon on the Earth are limestone rocks and dissolved carbon dioxide in seawater. Carbon makes its way through living things as carbon-based compounds like energy molecules, fats, and proteins, eventually cycling back to the atmosphere. Nitrogen is mainly found in the atmosphere as well and enters the ecosystem as nutrients for plants. As it travels through food webs, nitrogen can leave as the organism dies and decomposes and eventually ends up back in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. Through this cycling, the atoms that make up all living and non-living things are used and used again, making nature a most efficient recycler.
So we'll skip over this one because you've already seen that. There's bacteria that live on your skin. One of the things that I learned recently is you hear people say, oh, it's flu season or something, you got to wash your hands in hand sanitizer over and over and over. That actually has a downside of killing some of the bacteria on your skin. And if you kill, there's good bacteria, as we find out, and there's bad bacteria. So there's a natural balance between the good bacteria is actually preventing the bad bacteria from causing you skin problems. So if you had some exposure to something where you had a lot of bacteria on your hands for some reason, you handled a decomposing piece of meat or something you found in your yard and you picked it up with your hand instead of a rubber glove or tongs or something, you might want to wash your hands in hand sanitizer or Neosporin soap. But in general, a lot of the people who are aware of this, they recommend you don't overdo it because you're actually killing the good bacteria. One of the things that you can use that I found out, and I actually use it myself, is silver compounds that you can put onto your skin, and it will kill the bad bacteria, but it isn't like a antibiotic where the bacteria will build up an immunity to it. So the silver will kill and sanitize wounds, or if you have any skin issues with regard to skin disruptions, you can buy that at the pharmacy, colloidal silver. So that's one. And then there's also bacteria in your eye. I thought that was very interesting. It's one of the only kinds of bacteria can live in the high salt concentration of the fluid. The tears that are in your eye have a high salt concentration. So that bacteria is exactly made to be able to live in your eye. And then I think we've all heard of these gut bacteria. You go to the store and you see a whole shelf full of what they call probiotics. So that's the good bacteria in your stomach that you need for your maintaining your digestive system. So wantonly killing the bacteria, both the good and the bad, is not a great thing to do. So it says that in order to maintain the good bacteria in your stomach, you want to eat a diet low in sugar, grains, and processed foods in general. And also you want to avoid taking too much antibiotics or chlorinated water, antibacterial soap, pollution, and agricultural chemicals can all harm the bacteria in your stomach. Also, using too many antibiotics, either in the animals that we eat or ourselves. The physicians don't want to prescribe antibiotics for every small case of some kind of problem that you might need. So sometimes you can skip the antibiotics, or they switch from one antibiotic to another, because the bacteria, within 2 or 3 generations, I read that it goes from 80% effective down to 5% effective. So the bacteria mutate very quickly because they're only a single cell, and they only have 1 million DNA basis pairs, where a human has 3.2 billion. So they have a tendency to be able to mutate to be antibiotic resistant. Alexander Fleming in 1928, he was the discoverer of antibiotics, and he found that bread mold killed bacteria. So that was his discovery, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1945 for that. The ugly is, we have to be aware that there's some really bad things out there, some pathogenic bacteria like cholera and syphilis and anthrax and leprosy and bubonic plague. So we have to be very aware and on our guard for those. So this is a video. This is, it's got a lot of information in it, but the thing that I wanted to draw to your attention is to look at how complex. This is going to talk about your immune system, the human immune system. And I want you, it's kind of a funny little cartoon, but I want you to see how incredibly complex this system is, and I think Stephanie will probably agree with that.
Every second of your life you are under attack. Billions of bacteria, viruses and fungi are trying to make you their home. So our bodies have developed a super complex little army with guards, soldiers, intelligence, weapons factories and communicators to protect you from, well, dying. For this video, let's assume the immune system has 12 different jobs. For example, kill enemies, communicate, etc. And it has 21 different cells and 2 protein forces. These cells have up to 4 different jobs. Let's assign them. Here are the interactions. Now, let's make this understandable. First of all, let's add colors to the jobs. Now, let's illustrate the cells. The central color represents the main job of the cell, while the surrounding ones represent secondary duties. Now, the immune system looks like this. Now, the interactions. Isn't this complexity just awesome? For this video, we will only talk about these cells and ignore the rest. So, what happens in the case of an infection? It's a beautiful day when suddenly a wild rusty nail appears and you cut yourself. The first barrier of the immune system is breached, your skin. Nearby bacteria seize on the opportunity and enter your wound. They start using up the body's resources and double their numbers about every 20 minutes. At first, they fly under the radar, but when a certain bacteria population is reached, they change their behavior and start to damage the body by changing the environment around them. The immune system has to stop them as fast as possible. First of all, your guard cells, known as macrophages, intervene. They are huge cells that guard every border region of the body. Most of the time, they alone can suffocate an attack because they can devour up to 100 intruders each. They swallow the intruder whole and trap it inside a membrane. Then the enemy gets broken down by enzymes and is killed. On top of that, they cause inflammation by ordering the blood vessels to release water into the battlefield so fighting becomes easier. You notice this as a very mild swelling. When the macrophages fight for too long, they call in heavy backup by releasing messenger proteins that communicate location and urgency. Neutrophils leave their patrol routes in the blood and move to the battlefield. The neutrophils fight so furiously that they kill healthy cells in the process. On top of that, they generate barriers that trap and kill the bacteria. They are indeed so deadly that they evolved to commit suicide after 5 days to prevent them from causing too much damage. If this is not enough to stop the invasion, the brain of the immune system kicks in. The dendritic cell gets active. It reacts to the signals of the soldiers and starts collecting samples from the enemies. They rip them into pieces and present the parts on their outer layer. Now, the dendritic cell makes a crucial decision. Should they call for antivirus forces that eradicate infected body cells or an army of bacteria killers? In this case, antibacteria forces are necessary. It then travels to the closest lymph node in about a day. Here, billions of helper and killer T cells are waiting to be activated. When T cells are born, they go through a difficult and complicated training process, and only a quarter survives. The surviving cells are equipped with a specific setup. And the dendritic cell is on its way looking for a helper T cell with a setup that's just right. It's looking for a helper T cell that can bind to the parts of the intruders which the dendritic cell has presented on its membrane. When it finally finds one, a chain reaction takes place. The helper T cell is activated. It quickly duplicates thousands of times. Some become memory T cells that stay in the lymph node and will make you practically immune against this enemy. Some travel to the field of battle to help out. And the third group goes on to travel to the center of the lymph node to activate a very powerful weapons factory. Like the T cells, they're born with a specific setup. And when a B cell and a T cell with the same setup meet, hell breaks loose. The B cell duplicates rapidly and starts producing millions of little weapons. They work so hard that they would literally die from exhaustion very fast. Here, helper T cells play another important role. They stimulate the hard-working factories and tell them, "Don't die yet, we still need you. Keep going." This also ensures that the factories die if the infection is over, so the body doesn't waste energy or hurt itself. But what is produced by the B cells? You've heard of them, of course, antibodies. Little proteins that are engineered to bind to the surface of the specific intruder. There are even different kinds of antibodies that have slightly different jobs. The helper T cells tell the plasma cells which type is needed the most in this particular invasion. Millions of them flood the blood and saturate the body. Meanwhile, at the site of infection, the situation is getting dire. the intruders have multiplied in number and start hurting the body. Guard and attack cells fight hard, but also die in the process. Helper T cells support them by ordering them to be more aggressive and to stay alive longer. But without help, they can't overwhelm the bacteria. But now the second line of defense arrives. Billions of antibodies flood the battlefield and disable lots of the intruders, rendering them helpless or killing them in the process. They also stun the bacteria and make them an easy target. Their back is built to connect to killer cells, so they can connect and kill the enemy more easily. Macrophages are especially good at gnoming up the bacteria which antibodies have attached to. Now, the balance shifts. In a team effort, the infection is wiped out. At this point, millions of body cells have already died. No big deal, the losses are quickly replenished. Most immune cells are now useless, and without the constant signals, they commit suicide, so as not to waste any resources. But some stay behind, the memory cells. If this enemy is encountered ever again in the future, they will be ready for it and probably kill it before you even notice. This was a very simplified explanation of parts of the immune system at work. Can you imagine how complex this system is? Even at this level, when we ignore so many players and all the chemistry. Life is awfully complicated, but if we take the time to understand it, we always encounter endless wonders and great beauty.
So let's talk about viruses. There's even more viruses on Earth than there are bacteria. This is a scanning electron microscope photo of a virus. It's kind of a weird looking thing. Looks like a spider with a penthouse on top of it. I don't know what it is, but they play a critical role in the Earth's biosphere. Again, the viruses are basically very useful in the ocean. We know about the viruses that cause illness, but they're also used to kill microbes in the ocean, and they redirect the carbon of the nutrition of these microbes in the ocean in order to give food to the small animals that live in the ocean. You've heard of the krill that the whales eat. They swim with their mouth open and they get trillions and trillions of these krill to feed on. So viruses are the things that kill the bacteria that make the krill healthy, and so that helps support. So one of the tiniest things supports one of the giant things, the whales. So a virus is actually very important. There's obviously all of the viruses that are associated with disease. HIV virus is one of them. But it's quite reasonable that the viruses that we know about could have come in the beginning when God created the earth and the heavens. It's reasonable to expect that the viruses were actually doing good, and only through the fall and through mutation that the viruses became harmful. So it's pretty amazing. And the viruses are not technically alive. They're a parasitic being, and they actually they have a form of DNA and RNA that they actually inject into a living cell, and then that DNA splices itself into the cell's DNA, and then that cell is controlled by the virus DNA, and that produces more virus. So they can't reproduce by themselves if they're isolated. They need a host to live on. And there's actually, it was fascinating to read, they're actually having a treatment to kill bacteria using viruses. So there's actually some medical treatments that they're coming up with that are specific viruses that would attack certain bacteria that would actually be a medical benefit. And The one thing that's interesting about that is because the virus, when it infects the host, it generates its own new virus. So when you take antibiotics, you have to take them for 5 or 10 days. They say, here's a bottle, take so many per day for the next 5 or 10 days, whatever it is, and you have to keep replenishing that. But if you had a virus that you had that was specifically tuned to the bacteria that they were trying to kill, you'd only have to take a small amount. That virus would then infect the bacteria, and then the bacteria would create their own destruction. So by producing more of the viruses, and so you wouldn't have to reload up with continuing to take antibiotic. So in summary, viruses are known to serve beneficial roles. Research is going on to teach us more. According to the model, diseases is not a result of viruses as much as a breakdown of the relationship between the host and the virus. So of the thousands of viruses that are out there, there's only actually a few that are very dangerous. And because of the role they play in the ocean of providing food for the small organisms that live in the ocean, they're critical to life on Earth. So if we did away with all of the viruses, we would die also. So even viruses are important. So the summary is, we tend to judge things are good or bad based on our limited knowledge. As time goes on, we learn more. We actually have learned a very great amount in the last 20 to 30 years. And so we learn what God's purpose is for all of these different beings. The outward appearance or the fear of something is usually based on how it looks or if it can do harm to us. And we don't really understand God's plan. So overall, we're trying to live in a sin-plagued world. And as we learn more and more about these things in the world that we live in, we see that there's good and bad, and there's a purpose for everything that we have on earth, God's purpose. So let me jump over to the suffering part. I'll try to do it pretty quickly. I think all of us, if we've witnessed to people, you're hit with this problem of, well, if you have a good God, why do you have pain and suffering in the world? Why do people die? Why do people get cancer? Why do they have brain tumors? Why do they have poor eyesight? Why do they have paralysis? Whatever. According to Jesus, suffering and sorrow are unnatural in the order of God. Pain is an intruder and an evil interloper who has invaded God's domain. And Jesus makes it very clear in many, many parts of the Bible that suffering does not originate with the Father. So that we have to be very careful of. And the people who attack you obviously are not people who are reading the Bible continuously, and they're not experts in the Bible. They're just saying, okay, well, I feel, this is my interpretation of the world, and so, I'm going to lay it all on God because I can't explain it. But, you'll see that there's many other reasons as we go through. But it has to be based on the Bible. Basically, in order to understand what God intends, you have to read the Bible, just as if you want to study Julius Caesar, you have to read about his life, or if you want to understand Adolf Hitler, you have to read books on his life. So we have to read God's book to understand, and the people who basically usually attack us are not people who are Bible readers. So that's one thing you can tell them. Okay, I'll have a discussion, but why don't you read these parts and then see if then we can have another discussion next week or tomorrow or whatever. Just the first slide again, in the beginning God created everything perfect. No death, abundance of food, companionship, fellowship with God. So we can't lay it at his doorstep. That's God's blessing. And then are humans the problem? And the Bible tells us in Romans 3, there's no one's righteous, not one. So we know that we're not righteous. And we even have a saying I wrote down, no one's perfect, dude, but I added the dude part. So we even say, we admit, we confess to ourselves, nobody's perfect, but that's God's standard, perfection. And man and woman chose willfully of their own free will, just as Satan, of his own free will, he chose to rebel. So, the original sin is something, I didn't think about it until I was at my doctor's office one day. I was filling in one of those 1,000 forms that you fill out, and it always asks you, fill in the family history, right? So I was thinking, this is a family history. Who brought death into the world? Adam. So he was the one that brought death into the world, and since we're all the descendants of Adam and Eve, we've inherited that. So, my joke is that next time you're in your doctor's office, if they have a box that says sin, you can check that. And he said, so death is, this is a consequence of the original sin. And wisdom, one of the things is God's knowledge is astoundingly higher than ours, immeasurably higher than ours. And so it says God's wisdom and knowledge are so deep that it's impossible to explain his decisions to or understand his ways. It's again in Romans. And I remember I'm telling a story on my kids. They used to love to go out riding in the car, but they had to take their juvenile vaccinations. So every time we would be out driving and I turned into the clinic that their pediatrician operated out of, they'd start to scream. And one screamed louder than the other, but I won't say who that is. They hated the needle. But, just as the kids when they're young don't understand that you're trying to do something to make them safe, and it's giving them pain. Sometimes I think God gives us pain and we don't understand. But if it's in his will, it's for his purpose. And so, the book of Job is just filled with, that's a whole, a book on discussion of this. And the Lord has his own purpose. We may not understand what it is, and he allowed Satan to afflict Job, even though he called Job in the land of Uz. There lived a man whose name was Job. The man was blameless and upright, and he feared God and shunned evil, but yet he was afflicted. So ultimately, Job was reinstated with all of his wealth and family and that, but he suffered. And his friends were, quote, throwing him under the bus, and his wife told him to curse God and die, right? So we know what other people, sometimes they jump to conclusions because we have such little information. We don't know what God's purpose is. And we're not God, although humans and even the angels, a third of the angels fell with Satan. We want to be in charge, but we know we have to lay our lives to Christ and to God. So, when you were offered by the Satan, the devil, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. We jumped at the chance because that's our nature, and we must understand. How to answer the good versus evil can occur on the earth. The fact that Satan caused Job's problems, he might be active in some of the problems that we're facing. And then since God made everything, I think he owns it, like Rob always says. I mean, you could think about a couple of passages in the beginning. God made the heavens and the earth. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made, in John. And so if a farmer has a ranch and he has some prized cattle, if he puts no trespassing signs up, maybe he's protecting those cattle from being rustled, or maybe he has a field of crops that he's growing for some medical purposes and he doesn't want them to be contaminated. So we have a hard time understanding that the earth and the whole universe was made by God, and since he made it, he owns it, and he has a say in what happens. And then another point is that we're really only passing through. Rob, I think, made a allusion to this either Wednesday or Sunday, I can't remember, but he says if you go to Europe on a vacation, you don't take your pictures down from your wall, and you don't take everything you own in your whole house and you put it in a giant container and ship it over to Europe, because you just don't be there for 2 weeks. So we have to think that way. Our ultimate home is in heaven. We're just passing through. And we're supposed to do many things while we're here, but it's ultimate, our destination is heaven, not earth. And it says over and over in the Bible, John 3:16, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And it says many, many times about everlasting life. So we're going to be with the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit in heaven. And so we need to have that eternal perspective when we're here on earth, when we're trying to work through some of the issues. And we live in a fallen world, and bad things can and do happen. So we just have to praise God, who's in control. And then, a lot of times you'll hear people say that adversity is a result of some kind of a spiritual inadequacy. That's absolutely not true. Absolutely, positively. God does deliver his people from trouble, but not always. So, we know Simon Peter was put in prison. He was scourged. He was crucified upside down. We have James, the brother of John. He was in prison and beheaded. Paul, the Apostle Paul, he was killed in Rome. So to be a follower of Jesus for the first century church meant suffering. It was a badge of devotion. And it says that Christ said all shall suffer persecution in Timothy. So we have to call that out. And we know, and I wanted to pay a special debt to the people that we have in this community of saints of Calvary Church. It says, when all kinds of trials and temptations crowd into our lives, my brothers and sisters, don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends. And that's very, very hard to do. But we have some really amazing people that we have in this church. And I just, call out a few names. Ruth, who's gone through cancer and is doing really well. Rich's wife. And we have Pauline, who came through her surgery. These are notes I got. These are from praise reports and from Sunshiners, basically. I get those emails. And we have John Anderson, who's gone through the cancer treatment. And these are words that I've excerpted from their emails. He's had a lot of blessings and miracles. John and Denise, they've come through. Have Tom Hunt, who had his heart problem, and Harry had the brain surgery. Have Joyce, who went through quadruple bypass surgery. Ted, who underwent cataract surgery, and just last night Scott was at the meeting, and he's cancer-free now. So I want to pay tribute to those people. These are people who have suffered, and they are such wonderful people in Christ that we should be all blessed by just knowing them. And I was hoping Rich would be here, but he told me when we were talking, he said that Ruth has really been deeply touched by what people have done for her, and her faith in Jesus has been so remarkably enlarged by what's happened over the last months of time. So we can't look at this, a trial is a trial, and so nobody likes to go through trials, but if you use it to give glory to God, that's the thing. So this is the last slide. Jesus declares that every experience which comes to us within the permissive will of God may be made to minister to us and used as a means of bringing glory to God. And Paul writes, I besought the Lord thrice that the pain in his side, he called it the thorn in his side. Right, Marty? Might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. Most gladly, therefore, you will rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And for when I am weak, I am strong. But in the end, God shall wipe away every tear and from our eyes, and there will be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, and there will be no more pain. And we're told that in Revelations 21:4. So there. Thank you. That's all I have.